Okay, definitely next. So my name is Christjian Blackburn. I am from CSUN. It is a pleasure to meet all of you. I am an undergraduate student and a philosophy major with the Willpower program. And so my research is philosophy research. And I am investigating free will itself. So it is a very big topic, right? So before we get into any of this, I'm going to be using the terms freedom, autonomy, and agency interchangeably a lot, because in this philosophy work, these words are often used very interchangeably, right? Now, the big thing that I wanted to cover here, because I'm not just going to read everything that's written on here, right, is when we talk about agency, there's something they really refer to a lot, which is called like a reason-responsive mechanism. This is a big deal in modern philosophy. And all this really refers to is like, are you capable of responding to good reasons? Like, if someone tells you something and it would actually serve you, are you capable of picking that up and applying it to your life? All of that is baked into it, right? So a good reason-responsive mechanism can react to good reasons. A bad reason-responsive mechanism, good reasons are immune to it. You can give them all the good reasons in the world, there's not going to be any sort of progress made there, right? Now, when we talk about autonomy and freedom, it's important because this is actually talking about like free will, which is a question that we've been grappling with since like ancient Greece, right? It's just like, do we possess free will? And a lot of people view that as a metaphysical question. And we're going to get into that because that's not the way that I'm going to approach this problem, right? And so most people, when it comes to freedom, autonomy, agency, right, they have this assumption that it is some sort of internal quality that is like privately possessed, right? Like this is the common notion. And there's a little footnote of how I describe agency on the second page of this, which is just like, agency is the capacity to form intentions, make choices, and act in ways that reflect one's values, goals, and sense of self, right? So it's not just behaving, but you have to like experience yourself as participating in your own life, right? And you have to think that your actions matter, and you have to think that the decisions you're making belong to yourself, right? Let's get to the next slide. This is all to talk about like what this is, right? Now, this is something I found out in my research that I thought was truly fascinating. When we get to like the origins of philosophy with like Plato and Aristotle, right? Freedom as a concept could not even be like thought about without thinking about how it related to communities and how it relates to like how a person interacts with their community. It was like a notion known as like embodied freedom, right? And the idea is that like, autonomy was something that you grew into through participation in your community and through mentorship, right? So it wasn't this idea that you just became autonomous. It was this idea that like you grew into autonomy through mentorship, through parenting, through participating in your community, right? And there really was no concept of free will or freedom separate from participation in one's community. That all started to come in like religious anxiety following Augustine of Hippo, when everyone started to be really worried about like, well, what about God? And if God controls everything, do we have free will? What's the point? If God controls everything, then in what sense could we be free, right? Now, then, as science became more popular and religion started to fall down, we started to recast this same question in secular terms, which became like, well, if every single thing in the universe is governed by the laws of nature and physics, right, how is any decision we make free in any sort of meaningful sense, right? And so the point of why I'm bringing this up is to show that like when philosophy was created, when we were talking about autonomy and agency, you could not talk about it as separate from communities. This idea that agency and free will is something that we talk about in relation to like the existence of God, right? This is a shift that I think we need to undo. I think free will has a lot more to do with how we interact with our communities, and I think that a lot of people are very confused because of this philosophical anxiety. Get to the next slide. So that's what I'm going to talk about, the displacement of agency from lived experience into abstract metaphysics, right? Agency used to be just something that described how you made decisions in your life, not something that described whether or not fictional or real beings that exist in alternative planes have something to say about your sexual patterns or behaviors, right? And so, how do I put this? Rather than treating freedom as a metaphysical puzzle, right, I'm really interested in the developmental and relational foundations, right? And as I started to focus on this, what I realized is this idea that freedom and agency are some kind of internal quality does not hold up to any sort of scrutiny, right? We are relational beings. And so this is where my thesis started to come in, is that for me, agency itself, free will itself, is tied up in social relationships. That is what relational autonomy is. This includes things like dependent on environment, access to material resources and institutions, right? Saying that you can make choices when you can't afford those choices or don't have the realistic ability to make those decisions is ridiculous, right? Now, it's also not generated in isolation. This is one of the things that I thought was hilarious when we're studying these philosophers. It's like they've never heard of parents. They legitimately think that that autonomy is developed internally, as if teachers and mentors and role models have nothing to do with this. And this was passed down to serious academic work. The idea that parents don't influence their children's agency, right? So absolutely ridiculous, right? Obviously, autonomy is something that develops over time. Children are not autonomous. It is something that you learn, and parents and mentors are supposed to kind of help facilitate through you. And a really interesting thing about this is how this ties into a lot of psychology and social work, because autonomy is built, damaged, and repaired through social environments. So in modern trauma research, we're discovering things like participating in group swimming classes or yoga classes or being in a college classroom has profound effects on healing trauma. And that is because we are relational beings, right? So what I think is really interesting about this philosophy is it can help you clue in on some of the things we're going to be discovering in the mental health sciences soon, which are things that like, hey, talk therapy isn't enough. You also need to go be embedded in your community. You need to participate in synchronized movements with other human beings. You need to have like people that you can communicate with, right? And it is like the whole perspective that makes progress, right? So the reason I bring this up now is just to say, why does this matter? Where does it go into? Let's go to the next slide. So something we're gonna have to talk about a lot is social scaffolding. Now I'm gonna get into like how autonomy works in this relational framework, right? Social scaffolding is the idea that much like a house, right? We need some kind of foundation to stand on, right? Like that the capacities for agency are something that are built by the people around us, right? And like our parents, our mentors, right? Through guidance, through support, through collaboration, right? It just means having access to caregivers, mentors, peers, stable housing, healthcare, and education, right? The easiest example of social scaffolding are supportive and loving parents who financially support you, give you a place to live, give you guidance, help you develop into a person, right? It enables you to reach heights that you would not otherwise be able to reach without that sort of support, right? Next. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about how agency forms and develops. So we first get into imitation, right? I get into like child developmental psychology and how babies learn through imitation, through watching their parents, which is an example of how we are relational beings, right? Because we learn through witnessing how people respond to arguments, witnessing how people manage and regulate their own emotions, listening to how people manage their lives, their schedules, work, pay their bills, right? All of these become practical, embodied examples that show us ways that we can live our life and present like options of futures to us is the idea, right? Like you think, hey, that's an option I could choose to take, right? Now, that's something that shows that it's not a fully formed capacity, right? That we just pops out of nowhere, right? Agency is something that developed over time through relational exposure and other people. Then we get to like relational modeling and embodied learning, right? Which has to do with, it's really just a complicated way of saying role models. I really think we've lost the importance of mentors and role models in modern society. All relational modeling is talking about is when you have a high quality role model, how that provides an example of a way that you could live your life and shows, it gives you a way to learn that is embodied. Embodied learning just means rather than just reading about it in a book, you're able to go out with your mentor and actually participate in these activities physically. And it is the participation in that activity that educates you, not just abstract theorizing, right? And so why does this matter, right? Because when we talk about autonomy this way, we can stop reframing healing as an individual rehabilitation project, and we can start to talk about how societies and cultures are structured and whether or not those societies and cultures are structured in a way that facilitates agency for individuals. You see what I'm saying? And so when people don't have networks of social support, right, autonomy doesn't simply weaken, it becomes like literally harder to imagine what kind of futures a person might inhabit, right? And so if we are relational embodied creatures, then people gaining more or less freedom is not an individual rehabilitation project. It is something that depends on governments, cultures, parents, and us as a community. Next slide, please. So a really great example of this is where we start getting into disabled perspectives, right? So a lot of these philosophers are talking about how autonomy is an independent quality that we develop on our own. A great example, I think, that counteracts that when examining it from a disabled perspective is the pillow angel case, which is a horrifying, absolutely horrifying event that happened in history, where parents of children with disabilities thought it was easier to care with them by preventing them from going through puberty and keeping them small so they would fit on a pillow. That's why they called them pillow babies, because they would lay on the pillow and they wouldn't move. And it was seen as easier for the caregivers to care for these children because they didn't move. And it made it easier. They didn't have to grow. They didn't have to, deal with changing them, or there were even fears about having to deal with their sexuality, right? And so the reason I bring this up is because it was never medical professionals that were pushing this. It was parents that decided it made their lives easier to get their children to go through developmental surgeries that altered the developments of their body, right? And so the entire point that I'm making when bringing up the pillow angel case is if caregivers have the ability to control your body, right? To talk about agency as some kind of independent quality, like if someone is put through a surgery against their will as a child in order to make their lives easier for their caregivers, in what sense is there any autonomy in that situation, right? So I'm using this disabled experience to show how autonomy is relational, right? The internalist notion of a private, stable identity can't account for how social structures literally shape disabled bodies, right? The common sense notion of an internal framework of agency doesn't account for these cases. You can't develop a reason-responsive mechanism that responds to good reasons when your biological reality and freedom are being compromised by the relationships that are supposed to support you and build you up through social scaffolding, right? You have no scaffolding. Next, please. So then we get into Edward Gein, because a lot of philosophers really love talking about Edward Gein. And he is the serial murderer who inspired the Texas Chainsaw Massacres. And so the reason that philosophers love to talk about Edward Gein is because they think that his schizophrenia is what caused him to engage in mass murder, right? And so my point is, when we look at relational models of agency, they provide us with much more reasonable conclusions about what is going on in these situations. Edward Gein was locked in a cage by his mother, was not allowed to make friends, was not allowed to have any sort of role models or peers or anyone who would teach him the difference between right and wrong. And so expecting Edward Gein to teach himself the difference between right and wrong when his mom is abusing him and locking him into a cage and telling him even heterosexuality is immoral is ridiculous, right? There are many high-functioning schizophrenics that are not serial murderers, right? But it's usually because they are put in situations where they're provided with social scaffolding that enables them to make different kinds of choices and perceive different kinds of futures. So my point in bringing up Edward Gein is whether or not a disability enhances or diminishes an agent's quality of life usually depends on relational factors. Are there going to be researchers that have conducted the relevant studies? Will the mental health practitioners in that area and government workers in the communities know about those studies? What model are they going to choose when providing therapy and treating their clients? Are they going to know about modern models, right? Like neuroplasticity, right? Will the client be a part of a community that even believes in the efficacy of treatment in the first place? There are people in rural communities that will never recommend them to any of these things. Will they be forced into receiving the treatment, and are they going to be forcibly medicated? These sorts of questions have a lot to do with how agency develops in disabled people, and it's not like an individual rehabilitation project. Next slide. We should be done. Yeah, so this is important, but we're going to go really fast. The curative imaginary is just describing how, it's a philosophical concept that describes that according to society, that the best way that a person can live their life is to be like normal, cured, fixed, right? And that disabled lives aren't like modes of being with their own inherent value, right? But that there are things that need to be erased in order to live like a more high functioning life, right? The reason I think this is really important is because this is an example of how we conflate flourishing, like the idea of living a good life, with becoming normal, right? Now freedom and agency has become this project of getting therapy and repairing yourself, rather than collectively transforming society through constructing better cultures and raising our children better, right? Okay, next, please. Sorry. And then this is going to be that. Just some more things. Perceived futures are very, very important. This has to do with the concept of like what kind of futures you perceive as possible for yourself, and it also has to do with the kind of forecasting that's given to you in your life. When I was diagnosed with autism as a child, they told me I would not be at college and that I would not be giving these research presentations because I was too disabled. This is an example of forecasting. This is an example of perceived futures, right? The way that people perceive that only certain kinds of futures were available to me as a byproduct of my disability. The talking about mentoring and modeling and everything shows that when we have high quality people in our support network, it opens up our perceived futures. There are new types of futures that we can imagine are possible, which we might be interested in attaining for ourselves, right? And so the reason I talk about all of this is to establish the necessity of improving social conditions in order to increase agency and autonomy in individuals. I hope that by proving that agency is relational, that we can emphasize the necessity of the improvement of our culture, politics, child rearing, and education for facilitating the agency of all people, not just heteronormative people, right? If agency is scaffolded by social and material conditions, then the project of freedom is a collective one. We need to transform the environments and in fact into environments that enable reflective, authentic life, right? And so really my goal is to call out governments, to call out families, to call out the way that we choose to live our lives ourselves. And my research really changed the way that I live my life. I started spending more time with my professors. I started networking with people on campus, which is how I ended up at this conference. And it's like through embedding yourself in social networks with people who care about you and support you, you will find that you can experience the benefits of these research firsthand. You know, and so this is just a call to do what you can to increase the agency in the people you love around you, right? By being there for them, by supporting them, right? And you know, I just think this is really important because I think too many people get caught in this position of like feeling like they need to fix themselves rather than realizing that like we are relational beings that exist in community, right? And you don't have to do everything on your own, right? It's like it's much easier when you participate with other people that are like-minded and caring and supportive. And I think in this modern society, we have really gotten very isolationist and have forgotten how important it is that we like connect with each other, support each other, and raise our children properly. And that's all.